The man stood at the entrance of the restaurant, his coat too thin for the October wind, his shoes worn down at the heel from a walk he had taken every year for the past 11 years. Inside, laughter rose over the sound of clinking glasses. Crystal chandeliers threw soft gold light across white tablecloths. He had not come for the food. He had come for a promise he made to a woman who was no longer alive to remind him of it. Before he could say a word, before anyone offered him a chair, a voice cut through the room, sharp and delighted with itself. "People like you don't belong here." The room erupted in laughter. The man simply smiled, the kind of smile that carries more history than anger ever could. 24 hours later, every person in that restaurant would wish they had stood beside him instead. Who was he, really? Why didn't a single word of that insult reach him? And why, when he turned to leave, did an older woman at a nearby table go pale, as though she recognized something no one else in the room did? By the end of tonight's story, you will understand exactly what that look meant. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Walter Hensley, a retired shop teacher who had taught in that town for 26 years. Every October, on the anniversary of his wife Margaret's passing, he returned to the restaurant where he'd proposed to her decades earlier, back when it was still a diner. He ordered the coffee she used to order and sat quietly for 1 hour before walking home. He never asked for special treatment. He simply wanted to remember her in peace. The woman who mocked him was Diane Whitmore, 46, owner of the town's most talked about real estate brokerage. She had grown up poor, raised above a laundromat, and had spent her adult life burying that memory under designer suits and country club luncheons. She wasn't really mocking Walter. She was mocking the girl she used to be. But nobody in that restaurant knew that, including her husband Richard, whose company leased its main office from a quiet local trust neither of them had ever thought to question. Walter walked home that night past the school where he used to teach, fed his dog Duke, and sat by a photograph of Margaret. He wasn't angry. He seemed, if anything, quietly amused, the way a person is amused watching someone trip over a truth they don't yet know exists. The next morning, a man in a tailored suit arrived at his door with a leather folder. Their conversation lasted 10 minutes, but it set in motion a decision that would reach Diane's life within days. By that Thursday, whispers moved through Diane's circle. Someone mentioned the name Hensley at the bank, then at the club, then in Richard's office. Diane dismissed it. Richard didn't. He recognized the name attached to the land trust that owned his company's building, and he lay awake that night with a small, cold thread of worry he couldn't explain away. The first blow landed Monday. Richard's company received notice that its lease would not be renewed in 90 days. Signed simply, W. Hensley. It turned out Walter had spent 30 years quietly funding scholarships, veterans programs, and small businesses through that trust, never once seeking credit. 2 days later, a financial audit revealed irregularities in how Richard's company reported earnings, an unrelated crisis that collided with the first at the worst possible moment. Diane felt the ground shifting beneath her for the first time in years. It was Emily, Diane's 22-year-old daughter, who discovered the truth first, an old newspaper article about a teacher who had donated his late wife's inheritance to help kids afford trade school. The photograph stopped her breath. It was Walter. When Diane read it, her hands trembled. The man she had humiliated in 20 seconds had spent 30 years quietly building nearly everything good in their town, and his trust now controlled the very building her husband's business depended on. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Diane's life. Layoffs began at Richard's company. Friends who had laughed loudest at the restaurant stopped returning her calls once their own households felt the ripple effects. Diane resigned from both her charity boards before anyone could ask her to. For the first time in decades, she woke up most mornings with nothing waiting for her, and the silence frightened her more than any failure ever had. One evening she sat alone at her kitchen table and finally cried, not for the money, but for the version of herself she no longer recognized. How would you feel watching everything you built collapse because of a single moment of cruelty you never expected to matter? 6 weeks later, Diane stood outside Walter's small house. When he opened the door, Duke barking softly beside him, he didn't look surprised. He simply stepped aside and offered her tea. Diane, who had rehearsed an apology the whole drive over, found herself speechless for a long moment before finally saying it plainly. She was sorry, not because her life had fallen apart, but because she had looked at a stranger and decided, in an instant, that he was worth nothing. Walter listened quietly and told her something Margaret used to say, that people rarely regret kindness, but they carry the weight of cruelty for the rest of their lives, whether they admit it or not. He didn't offer to fix her company or restore her old life. Instead, he offered her something smaller and harder, a chance to help him sort scholarship applications twice a week. Diane accepted, not out of desperation, but because for the first time in years, she wanted to build something instead of defending what she already had. Months later, Diane sat beside Walter at a small scholarship dinner. No chandeliers, no designer dresses, just folding tables and homemade food prepared by families whose children now had a chance because of a man they once dismissed. She thought often about that night at the restaurant, about how close she had come to never learning the lesson that changed her. Walter never brought it up again. He didn't need to. His life had already spoken louder than her words ever could. This story asks something simple of all of us. How many people do we walk past every day, judging them in an instant, never imagining the weight of the life they're quietly carrying? If you were in that restaurant that night, would you have laughed along, stayed silent, or stood beside him? Tell us honestly in the comments below. We read every single one. If tonight's story moved you, make sure you're subscribed, because next week we're telling the story of a nurse who spent 30 years caring for strangers, never knowing one of them would return to save her own life. You won't want to miss it.